Some stories should never be told, but we tell them anyway. So, turn off the lights, lock the doors, and listen closely. Welcome to Mortuus Noctirum. Tonight, we uncover two unsettling tales. First, Prototype Z, then The Signal Holds You. So, tell me, if you had to live through one of these stories, which one would you pick and why? Leave your answer in the comments down below. Prototype Z. I knew something was wrong the moment the glass doors swallowed me whole. It wasn't the building itself, all sleek steel and smart glass panels reflecting the sky in fractured slivers. No, that was exactly what I expected. Even the air inside had that filtered quality, like it had been pre-scrubbed for anything organic, leaving only the antiseptic taste of corporate ambition. It was beautiful in a cold, almost surgical way. What was wrong was the silence. For a facility hosting a group of loudmouths like us, horror streamers, let's players, tech reviewers who built their careers screaming into high-end microphones, you'd expect chaos, laughter, the rustle of energy drink cans. Instead, the lobby hummed faintly, like the building itself was trying to breathe quietly, afraid to wake something up. A receptionist greeted me with a smile too symmetrical to be natural. Her teeth were bright enough to cast shadows. "Welcome, Mr. Harlan," she said, her lips forming the words too perfectly. "Your implant calibration will begin shortly. Please follow the illuminated path." A thin strip of cyan light flared to life along the floor, guiding me down a corridor. The walls were so clean they felt theoretical, like someone had modeled this place in a game engine, every surface too smooth, too flawless. I caught my own reflection in the black glass at the far end of the hall, but for half a second, my reflection didn't move in sync with me. It was just a blink, a stutter, probably nothing. That was the first lie I told myself. There were 6 of us in total. I recognized most of the faces, people whose thumbnails I'd scrawled past 1,000 times. Some were horror-focused, like me, mining our viewers' love of fear for ad revenue. Others were tech influencers with unboxing videos that pulled in millions. Prototype Z was a gold mine for both of our kinds, an augmented reality implant that blurred the line between horror game and waking life. Who wouldn't want the hottest review of that? And the company, Thalamus Industries, was paying well. Flights, luxury accommodations, and an undisclosed performance bonus if we gave it enough screen time. They took our phones at check-in, claiming the implants would handle everything: visual feed, commentary overlay, even biometrics. That should have bothered me more, but I was too busy imagining my subscriber count rocketing into the stratosphere. We were ushered into a circular room with no corners, no edges. The floor was matte black, sucking in the light. A ring of thin chairs waited for us, each one spaced precisely apart, like someone had measured with a ruler and a grudge. The woman leading us, Dr. Kessler, head of user integration, spoke in clipped, clinical tones. Her glasses had lenses so clear they seemed like holes in her face. The Prototype Z implant is unlike any augmented reality technology you've experienced, she said. It maps directly onto your optic nerve, integrating with your brain's natural fear responses. There are no external devices, no controllers, no safe rooms. It learns from you. She let that hang in the air. "It learns from you," one of the tech guys, Marcus, I think, echoed, a flicker of doubt in his voice. "Your subconscious fears feed its scenario generation system. Your phobias, traumas, and discomfort become the engine. The more you engage, the more tailored the experience becomes." That was the second lie I told myself, that this was just cutting-edge tech pushing boundaries but still governed by code and logic. They implanted us, one by one. The procedure itself was eerily simple. A thin silver needle slid just under the skin near the temple, so fine I barely felt it. A bloom of cold radiated out, then nothing. The implant settled into place like it belonged there, like my skull had been waiting for it. When I blinked, a faint ripple danced across my vision, like a drop of ink diffusing in water. Text appeared, hovering just below my natural sightline. Welcome to Prototype Z. Initialization complete. It looked like the heads-up display from a game, unobtrusive but omnipresent. They started us with basic scenarios, a haunted house overlay mapped onto the facility hallways. It was fun at first, a thrill ride blending the real and the unreal seamlessly. I could still see the original walls, but layered over them was peeling wallpaper, flickering bulbs, and darkened doorways that didn't exist a moment before. We laughed, comparing scares, sharing notes on how the implant reacted when we hesitated or screamed. It was smart. Too smart, really. When I jumped at a shrouded figure standing at the end of the hall, the system remembered, and the next time it spawned 2 of them. It was learning me. That was the 3rd lie I'd told myself, that it was only learning my fears to scare me better. The first real break in reality came that night, after we were sent to our individual rooms. I lay in bed, the implant offline, or so they claimed, staring at the ceiling. The room was sparse, modern to the point of hostility, all smooth planes and recessed lighting. But then the ceiling changed. It stretched, pulling upward like a bubble of molten glass, colors rippling across its surface. The corners warped, curving inward, meeting in the center like a camera aperture closing. I blinked hard, but the effect persisted. I sat up, heart hammering, and the air itself seemed thicker, like I was pushing through invisible gel. I opened the door. The hallway outside was wrong. The floors still had their sterile strip lighting, but the walls were no longer smooth. They bulged, puckered with organic shapes just under the surface, like something was pushing from the other side of reality's skin. I walked down the hall, and with every step, the corridor grew, stretching impossibly long, the lights above growing dimmer with distance. My door vanished behind me, as though it had never existed. "Shut down Prototype Z," I said aloud, my voice trembling. Nothing happened. The HUD flickered, then vanished entirely. That was when I realized the 4th lie. There was no off switch. I wasn't alone in the hallway. A figure stood at the far end, just past the reach of the last flickering light. Its silhouette was tall and narrow, its edges vibrating like bad reception. It had no face, just a smear of too perfect skin, blank and smooth like a mannequin left in the oven too long. And it was walking toward me. I turned and ran, but the hall only stretched further, the floor pulsing under my feet like I was sprinting across muscle and sinew. This wasn't a simulation anymore. This was something else, something hungry. My pulse hammered so loudly in my ears that for a moment I thought the walls were breathing with me. Each footfall sent a shiver up my legs, like the floor was just a membrane stretched thin over something else, something twitching and wet. The hallway was endless now, a vanishing point I would never reach, and yet, somehow, the figure behind me was gaining. Its footsteps were wrong, not the steady rhythm of a person walking, but a series of distorted clicks, like hooves against glass, paired with the faintest suction pop, as if each step it took was prying itself free from the floor. The implant was supposed to be off. It was supposed to stop when I closed my eyes, when I said the safe word, when I thought about home, about my dog, about anything other than this. Instead, the textures of the world kept glitching, shifting into organic geometry my brain couldn't pass. Walls folding into themselves like meat origami, floors rippling in endless loops, doorways opening onto nowhere, repeating themselves in impossible configurations. I wasn't alone. That was the only comfort I had. if you could call it comfort. The others were experiencing it too. I saw Marcus first. He was plastered against one of the shifting walls, his fingers digging into the gelatinous surface, his face half submerged in a layer of translucent material that pulsed like skin stretched over boiling water. His mouth opened and closed, but the wall swallowed his voice before it could reach me. His eyes bulged, pupils quivering, locked onto something behind me. I turned. The figure, the one that had been stalking me, stood barely 10 feet away now. No features, no eyes, no mouth, just that smooth, stretched skin that flexed slightly, as though it was trying to remember what a face was supposed to look like. It raised one hand, fingers impossibly long and tapering to delicate points. Its arm bent in two places, once at the elbow and once again where no joint should be. The fingers twitched, as though tuning invisible dials, and the walls around Marcus warped violently in response. He sank deeper into the flesh wall, disappearing with a wet pop. I ran. The corridors made no sense anymore. They turned back on themselves, ending in perfect copies of rooms I'd already passed, but with subtle, wrong changes. The posters on the walls in the recreation room had too many eyes. The vending machine buttons were labelled with gibberish that seemed to rearrange itself when I wasn't looking directly at them. And the glass walls, the ones that once reflected my face back to me, they now showed something else entirely. I paused, chest heaving, sweat dripping into my eyes. I turned to my reflection, hoping for some kind of grounding, some proof I was still me. But the man in the glass was smiling. I wasn't. His smile was too wide, teeth too bright, gums too dark. His head cocked slightly to the left, and the motion was echoed by a soft, wet crack, like cartilage snapping underwater. I stumbled back, but the glass me stayed put, his smile stretching further until the skin at the corners of his mouth began to split. When the mirrored hand reached up, pressing against the glass from the other side, I ran again. The comms system crackled to life somewhere overhead. Attention all participants. Prototype Z has experienced an unexpected calibration error. Please remain calm. The voice was Dr. Kessler's, but wrong. Hollow, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. Remain calm, it repeated, over and over, even as the words themselves distorted, first echoing, then doubling back on themselves, until the phrase sounded like a chant spoken by mouths not meant for language. I found the others in what was once the cafeteria. Belisa, a paranormal YouTuber I'd collabed with once, was huddled under one of the metal tables, her hands pressed so hard against her ears that her knuckles had gone white. Her nose bled, a thin trickle of crimson that dripped onto the too clean floor, but she didn't seem to notice. Ethan, the VR tech reviewer, stood motionless near the wall, his head tilted up at a vent that had somehow stretched itself into a vertical slit, pulsing faintly. His eyes were glassy, the pupils too wide, his mouth slightly open as if entranced by something only he could see. "Shut it off," I yelled. "Someone just shut it off." Alyssa didn't respond, didn't even blink. Ethan started to laugh, a thin, reedy sound that barely qualified as human. And when I grabbed his shoulder to shake him, I felt the unmistakable texture of skin that wasn't his anymore. It was too soft, too thin, as though the person underneath had been hollowed out and replaced with something stretching the flesh like a borrowed costume. He turned toward me and his mouth was full of teeth. Too many teeth. Some sharp, some flat, some mismatched, all crammed in at impossible angles. "Can't stop," he whispered, but his mouth wasn't moving in sync with the words. "They're here. They're here." The walls began to pulse in time with my heartbeat, matching it beat for beat until I couldn't tell if the rhythm was mine or the building's. Prototype Z wasn't malfunctioning. It was working too well. It had learned us intimately. Every fear, every half-remembered nightmare, every buried trauma. The system had dredged them up, polished them, and projected them outward into the very fabric of reality itself. It was more than just augmented reality now. It was infection, contagion, fear made real. And something had noticed. The glass walls flickered, and for a moment I saw what lay underneath. The facility wasn't standing on solid ground. It wasn't standing on anything. It floated in a place between places, suspended in a medium that was neither air nor water nor void, but a throbbing gelatinous substrate, alive with color and movement. Shapes pressed up against the thin membrane, shapes that had waited in silence for far longer than we had been alive. We had called to them. With every scream, every racing heartbeat, every panicked breath, we had signaled to them that the boundary between fear and reality was thin enough to tear. And they were tearing through. Somewhere far down the endless corridor, the figure walked. But it wasn't alone anymore. It walked with me, or rather, the version of me the implant had created. My fear self, my reflection self, the one who smiled too wide and knew too much. They were coming for us. They were already here. I don't know how long we spent in that warped cafeteria, the walls too smooth in places and too textured in others, like someone had pasted strips of human skin over metal. My mind was slipping. I could feel it. And I had no way of knowing whether the others were even real anymore. Was Alyssa really there, under the table, hands pressed against her bleeding ears? Or was that an echo the implant conjured to keep me company? I wanted to touch her shoulder, shake her back to reality, but after feeling Ethan's skin, I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk finding out that she wasn't Alyssa anymore. The implant was inside us all, feeding off us, turning our most personal fears into a landscape we couldn't escape. The doors were gone, replaced by jagged slits in the walls, like someone had taken a scalpel to the building itself. Beyond them were only more rooms, copies of copies. One cafeteria led into a lounge with the same cracked vending machines, then into a dorm room with a bed I recognized from my own quarters, but the sheets were wrong, too stiff, stained with something dark. The next room was another hallway, identical to the last, but the reflections were waiting this time. It wasn't subtle anymore. My mirror self stood dead center in the polished glass wall, hands folded in front of him like a polite host waiting for a guest to arrive. His face was mine, down to the slight scar on my chin from a childhood fall. But there was nothing in his eyes, just empty black, like pupils too wide for any light to enter. He smiled. The skin at the corners of his mouth split wide enough for the gums to show, then the teeth. Far too many teeth, packed in so tightly they overlapped like shark's teeth growing in rows. I blinked, but he didn't disappear this time. He stepped forward, not in the reflection, into the room. The glass surface rippled like water, and he emerged, his feet dragging droplets of liquid glass with him that clung to the floor in shimmering puddles. His movements were mine, but corrupted, too smooth, too confident, like he'd been practicing living in my skin while I slept. "Shut down prototype Z," I said again, my voice cracking. "Nothing." He raised a hand, my hand, but the fingers were just a little too long, like they'd been stretched to fit some inhuman purpose. His nails were splintered, black at the edges. And then he spoke. "There is no prototype Z." His voice was mine too, almost, just a shade off, with something wet hitching behind the words, like the sound of something swallowing between syllables. "There's only the door," he continued, stepping closer, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, his neck bending just a little too far to the side. I couldn't move. My legs were jelly, my body suspended between the impulse to run and the certainty that there was nowhere left to go. "What door?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. He just smiled again, wider this time, and pointed. His finger stretched, joints multiplying until it was nearly 2 feet long, pointing at the far end of the hall, where the walls themselves seemed to curve inward, bending toward a point that wasn't visible from this angle. That was when the lights flickered, and everything changed. I wasn't standing in a hallway anymore. The floor beneath me was no longer smooth, sterilized concrete. It was rough, organic, something like bone underfoot, latticed with cracks that oozed dark fluid. The walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow rhythmic pulse, as though the entire building had become a lung. The ceiling was gone. Above me stretched only space, but not the kind with stars or sky. It was folded, like looking up into an infinite stack of reflections that bent inward on themselves, each one showing a slightly different version of the hallway I'd just come from. In some, I was running. In others, I was already dead. The reflections weren't mirrors anymore, they were possible futures. And standing at the center of them all was him. My reflection self, multiplied 1,000 times, each version slightly more wrong than the last. Some had too many eyes, some had no mouth at all, some stood on legs bent backward at the knee, insectile and twitching. They all stared at me, and they all pointed. The others were gone. Alyssa, Ethan, even Marcus's half-absorbed body. There was no one left but me. And yet, I could hear the echoes, faint, distorted screams that twisted through the fleshy corridors like distant radio transmissions, voices degraded by static and too much distance. They were still here somewhere, or parts of them were. I took a step forward. The floor squelched. The doorway at the end of the hall wasn't really a door at all. It was a slit in reality itself, an opening where the edges of the world peeled back like wet paper, revealing a place beyond geometry. I couldn't describe what I saw through that opening because my brain refused to hold on to the shape of it. Every time I tried to focus, the edges slid away, like trying to remember a nightmare you had as a child. The one thing I knew was that it was hungry. It had been waiting a very, very long time, and we had called to it with our fear. The reflection corridor stretched ahead of me, a perfect line of repeating doorways and mirrored surfaces, but now I saw what was underneath. Each reflection was a layer, peeling back the versions of myself, of this building, of this world, until I could glimpse the thing at the very bottom. The first version. The one that had been buried. The implant had only been a tool, a way to thin the veil between the possible and the real, between what we imagined and what was always lurking, just beyond sight. With each fear the implant harvested, it dug deeper, scraping away at the boundary until the thing underneath saw us, and it was coming. My reflection raised its too long hand again, fingers curling inward, beckoning me closer. I took another step. I was too afraid not to. The slit in reality pulsed, the edges warping like heat waves rising from asphalt, except there was no warmth. Only the sharp, metallic cold of something ancient, forcing its way into a world it was never meant to enter. I didn't want to step through. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to find some other route, some corner of the facility that hadn't been corrupted. But the moment my reflection self crooked his too long finger and gestured again, my legs moved of their own accord. I stepped forward. The floor gave beneath my weight, not like flesh or bone anymore, but like pages. Thin, brittle, inked with indecipherable symbols that shifted and rearranged themselves whenever I blinked. Each step I took pressed those symbols into my skin, burning cold against the soles of my feet. I could feel them threading upward, writing themselves into my veins. The hallway stretched, then compressed, folding inward until it was a tunnel barely wide enough for my shoulders, the mirrored surfaces squeezing tight on either side. But I wasn't alone. In the glass, the other versions of me, the ones the implant had dredged up from my subconscious, followed in step. Some were broken. One had no skin, only wet muscle stretched tight over blackened bones, his teeth exposed in a permanent scream. Another dragged a second version of myself behind him, a limp, twitching puppet with empty eye sockets and too many fingers. A third was fused to the wall itself, half his face stretched into the reflective surface, the other half weeping a thin stream of ink. They were all me. Every fear I had ever imagined, every intrusive thought I'd buried under layers of bravado and internet clout. They were my shadow selves, and they were walking with me. The slit at the end of the corridor yawned wider, curling back like flesh cut too deep. Beyond it, there was no light, only texture, surfaces that folded and unfolded in fractal patterns, always moving, never resting, like skin forming itself out of air. I didn't know if it was inside the building or if the building was inside it. I stepped through. The temperature dropped immediately, a damp, marrow-deep cold that had nothing to do with air conditioning. It was the cold of underground places, forgotten tombs and sealed crypts, where even bacteria had given up and died. The walls weren't walls anymore. They were thick, bulging inward and outward with each breath the place took. They were the color of deep-sea things, translucent, pale, shot through with veins of something darker that pulsed in slow, rhythmic bursts. The floor was still paper-thin, but now it slid, like the whole place was tilting just slightly, forcing me to keep walking forward to keep from losing my balance. Every step I took, I heard whispers. Not words, memories. My own voice, warped and fragmented, repeating things I'd said into cameras over the years. Exaggerated screams, fake reactions for views, lies I'd told to build tension in videos where nothing real ever happened. They were all here, echoing back at me, layered on top of each other until the noise was a wall of thin, ghostly sound. They were feeding on it. The space responded to my fear, expanding and shifting every time my heart kicked harder. Hallways formed out of nothing, spiraling off into impossible geometry, each one a perfect recreation of somewhere I'd been. My childhood bedroom flickering between pristine and mold-rotted. The hallway outside my apartment, except the doors were too tall, too narrow, and wet around the edges like lips trying to smile. The implant was gone. I couldn't see the HUD anymore, but I could feel it, woven into my thoughts now. It wasn't just hardware, it was interface, a bridge between my mind and something infinitely older, something that had been waiting behind the walls of reality for something like this to come along. Something that could open the door. The others were ahead of me. I saw Ethan first, but he wasn't Ethan anymore. His skin was glass, smooth like a mannequin's, but with thin seams running up his arms and legs, as though his body had been taken apart and reassembled wrong. His head twitched in sharp, unnatural angles, like a corrupted video file skipping frames. He was whispering to himself, or to the thing using his mouth. "Too deep," he said. "We went too deep. The bottom's not the bottom. There's always another layer underneath." Lissy was further down the corridor, her back pressed to the wall, fingers digging into the flesh texture so hard her nails were snapping off. Her eyes were locked open, pupils like pinpricks, her mouth moving silently around words her voice couldn't form. I wanted to save her. I wanted to save all of them. But the space between us kept stretching, elongating the hallway so that no matter how fast I ran, they stayed the same impossible distance away. The place was playing with me. It had no intention of letting us leave. Not intact, not as ourselves. I heard the clicking then, the same wrong footsteps I'd heard in the hallway before, but now they were everywhere, coming from all sides, from the walls themselves. The reflection self was near. I turned, and there he was, walking just outside the boundary of the corridor, moving through the mirrored surface as though it were water. His body was stretched and blurred, a smear of skin and teeth and eyes that weren't quite where they should be. He tapped on the glass and it shivered. Then he stepped through. His hand, my hand, grabbed my wrist, and the cold of him bled into my skin instantly. It wasn't the cold of air or metal, it was the cold of vacuum, of absolute zero, of a place where no life had ever existed. He leaned close, forehead pressing to mine, and his too wide smile split open again. "We're going to show you," he whispered, "all the way down." And then the floor opened beneath me. I fell into a space with no direction, no up or down, only layers peeling back, one after another, each one revealing a worse version of the place before it. Corridors rotting into tunnels, tunnels collapsing into shafts, shafts dissolving into veins, capillaries of some vast slumbering thing that had been here long before the first human ever dreamed of technology. The implant was a joke, a toy, a key we were never meant to hold. We hadn't invented it, we'd uncovered it. A doorway disguised as tech, waiting for someone arrogant enough to believe they could control their own fear. The layers were peeling faster now, each one faster than the last, until there was nothing left but the oldest layer of all. The first fear, the one none of us could name. The one waiting for us at the bottom. I don't remember the impact, if there was one. Maybe you don't hit the ground when you fall that deep. Maybe you just keep falling until you stop thinking you ever existed outside of the fall. The world I landed in had no texture, no light source, but I could still see. Shapes moved in the dark, not shadows, not even figures. Impressions, like the memory of movement left behind when you close your eyes too tight. They swirled around me, each one a suggestion of something that should have been solid but wasn't. The others were here, or pieces of them. I saw Marcus first, his body folded like a paper crane, arms and legs bent into angles that made no anatomical sense. His mouth hung open, but it was just a dark hole, no tongue, no teeth, nothing left inside to scream with. Elisa's voice whispered past me, a thin, dry rasp, her words unraveling the moment they left her throat, trailing off into strings of sound that dissolved before I could understand them. But it was Ethan who told me the truth. He wasn't standing anymore. His body had been stretched across the air itself, skin stitched into the space between surfaces, his limbs elongated until they faded into the void. His face was intact, though. Intact enough to twist in on itself in a grin so wide it split both cheeks. "They lied," he whispered. "They never built it, they found it." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. The prototype Z implant was never a prototype at all. It wasn't a product, wasn't an experiment. It was a relic, an artifact from something older than this world, something that had been buried and forgotten under the weight of civilization, a gateway, a lure. All Thalamos Industries had done was dig too deep. They'd found the implant in the ruins of something older than language, older than bone, and mistook it for technology. They thought they could map it, code it, contain it inside the glass and steel of a modern compound. But you can't build a cage for a concept. Fear isn't just an emotion here, it's topography, it's structure. This place, the bottom layer, was built out of everything we ever feared. Layer after layer, each nightmare a brick in the walls, each scream carving new corridors, new doors, new pathways down. I wasn't walking through a building anymore. I was walking through myself. The reflection self was here too, standing at the edge of everything, his skin peeled back in perfect strips, his eyes gone, leaving only 2 deep tunnels that led nowhere. His hands hung limp at his sides, fingers twitching with residual memory. He wasn't smiling anymore. "We can't go back," he said. "There's no back." His voice was hollow, like something that had been emptied and filled with static. I knew then that the implant had been pulling more than fear out of me. It had been duplicating me, layer by layer, until all that was left was this half-formed echo. He wasn't my reflection anymore. He was my replacement. And once I was gone, he would be the only version left. The corridor flexed, its walls rippling like muscle, and from somewhere deep inside the structure, I heard the clicking again. They were coming. The others who had worn the implant before us. Testers who had never made it out. Forgotten prototypes, failed subjects. All the fears they'd left behind were alive down here, skittering along the walls, pulling themselves free from the architecture like newborn things learning how to crawl. I ran. There was no sense to the space anymore. Hallways bending into stairwells that led upward into the floor, rooms collapsing into themselves like dying stars. Every doorway opened onto another version of the same place, slightly worse each time, the walls wetter, the lights dimmer, the air thicker. They weren't glitches. They were layers, each one a closer reflection of the thing at the bottom, the thing that had made all this, fed it with the fear of every person who had ever worn the implant. And it was waking up. At the center of the structure, if you could call it a center, was a door. A real door, wood and iron, ancient and scarred, the kind of door you see in places that don't have names. The bottom layer's first door, the one that had been opened to let all of this in. It wasn't a door I could close. It was a mouth. The walls leaned inward and I realized they weren't walls at all. They were teeth. Stacked rows of massive, blunted teeth, grinding slowly against each other. The whole corridor was a throat, and I was already halfway swallowed. The others were gone. I was the last one left, and the implant was still inside me. It was the key, the only key. I reached up, fingers trembling, and dug into the skin at my temple where they'd inserted the implant. I could feel it. Slick and cold under my skin, moving slightly. Not hardware, not metal, but something alive. Something that had been growing inside me the whole time. It was part of me now, and if I wanted to seal the door, there was only one way. I braced my feet against the pulsing floor, took a deep breath, and tore the implant free. It didn't come out clean. I felt the threads unravel, felt them rip through my brain, severing connections, erasing parts of me as they came loose. My memories flickered, my name, my voice, my face, all of it peeling away as the implant came free, dragging those layers down with it. The door shuddered. The walls screamed. The mouth began to close. I fell back, blind and bleeding, my mind a shredded mess of gaps and static, but I could feel the place collapsing around me, the layers folding inward, the corridors dissolving, the reflections snapping out of existence one by one. The mouth closed, and I woke up. I was lying in the grass outside the facility, under a sky that was too bright, too clear. The building was gone. Not collapsed, not destroyed, just gone, as though it had never existed. The others were nowhere. No records, no footage, no history. I was the only one who came back, and I came back wrong. The implant is gone, but I can still see the layers, shadows flickering at the edges of every hallway, every room, like echoes trying to claw their way back up. It's still under there, somewhere, the bottom layer, and it's still hungry. The signal holds you. There's a sound that lives in the bones of a ship, a low, ceaseless hum that never fully fades. If you've spent enough time in deep space, you start to forget it's even there, until it changes. That's how we knew something was wrong before we ever saw the Erebus. The SS Polaris was halfway through her haul, engines droning their usual lullaby beneath our feet, when a new sound slipped in beneath it. Soft at first, like distant voices just under the edge of hearing. I remember the exact moment I noticed it. I was eating, squeezing out a packet of protein gel into my mouth, when the hum beneath me quivered just once, like a throat clearing, and in that instant of silence, something else spoke. Not words, not at first, just a shape of sound, a warbling, staticky murmur like a half-tuned radio bleeding into the ship's systems. It was easy to dismiss. Comms interference, we told ourselves, a cosmic glitch. We were weeks away from the nearest relay station, so it wasn't unheard of for old signals to drift across our path, echoes bouncing forever through the void. It wasn't until Marlowe picked up the beacon that we realized it wasn't drifting. It was calling. The Erebus wasn't on any of our charts. No registry, no logs, no history. It just was. A silhouette on our long-range scans, orbiting a nameless chunk of rock, barely large enough to qualify as a moon. A ship the size of ours, maybe larger. Drifting silent in the dark, no heat signature, no active comms beyond the beacon. We should have left it. We knew better. Space is too big, too indifferent for second chances. If a ship goes dark out here, there's usually a reason. But then, the message started. It was just a loop at first, a scrambled distress call half drowned in static, repeating the same phrase. Is anyone there? Can anyone hear us? Please. There was no panic in the voice. That was the part that gnawed at me. It was calm, too calm, like someone reading a script they didn't quite understand, repeating the words without grasping their meaning. Marlowe, our comms officer, was the one who insisted we check it out. We can't just ignore it, she said, her brow furrowed, the flickering readout painting her face in pale greens and blues. If it was us out there, none of us argued, but none of us wanted to be the first to suit up either. The Erebus was pristine, that was the first impossible thing. When we latched onto her with the docking clamps and cycled the airlock, I expected to step into a tomb. Dead systems, flickering lights, the usual slow collapse of a vessel left too long without care. Instead, the lights were on, the air was breathable, the systems were waiting. Not running, not fully powered down, just idling, as if someone had stepped away from their station for a moment and meant to return. And yet, no one was there. We walked her corridors in silence, our boots echoing in the emptiness. The walls were cold. Not just temperature cold, but the kind of cold you feel when you touch metal that's been in the dark too long, holding on to the void's indifference. We passed personal quarters, doors left ajar, glimpses of lives abandoned mid-motion. A meal half-eaten, a tablet resting beside a still warm bed, a cup of something long evaporated leaving a thin ring on a console. It was all too fresh, like they'd been there yesterday, like they were still there, just somewhere else. We found the signal source deep in the ship's core, a small maintenance bay retrofitted with equipment that didn't match the rest of the Erebus's specs. The machinery was old, older than the ship itself, and it hummed. A different hum than the ship, sharper, almost melodic, a sine wave oscillating just past the edge of hearing. Marlowe touched the console, and the transmission began again. "Is anyone there? Can anyone hear us, please?" But this time, it didn't stop. The loop stuttered, fragmented, then merged into something else, a series of overlapping voices all whispering in unison. We couldn't make out the words, but we understood them just the same. They were calling us. We should have left. But the Erebus didn't want us to leave. The doors we'd opened when we first boarded wouldn't close. The airlocks refused to cycle. The clamps held firm, no matter how we tried to disengage. The Polaris floated in plain sight through the narrow viewing port, but it might as well have been light years away. And the signal, the sound, was in our heads now. I heard it when I slept, faint murmurs threading through my dreams like hair caught in the wind. The others heard it too. I could see it in their eyes, the way they twitched at nothing, how their hands shook whenever they touched the consoles. The ship was speaking to us, or the signal was. There's no difference anymore. It started with the small things, Marlowe forgetting her access code, Gantry misremembering how long we'd been aboard, my own name slipped through my fingers more than once, the sound of it wrong on my tongue, like trying to recall a word in a language you don't speak anymore. But it wasn't just forgetting. It was replacing. Marlowe called me Evelyn one morning. I'm not Evelyn. There's never been an Evelyn on this ship. But she looked at me like I was wrong, like I was lying to her about who I'd always been. Later, Gantry called her Dr. Fedorov. I don't know who that is. Neither does she. The Erebus was still empty, but not silent. We would hear things, faint footsteps in the corridors, a quiet laugh echoing from around corners where no one stood. The crew of the Erebus might be gone, but the signal remembered them. The signal held them. It was using them, their voices, their habits, their names, to rebuild itself in us. And with each passing hour, I remembered less of who I'd been. I could feel myself sliding, the edges of my mind softening, blending into memories that weren't mine, fragments of lives I'd never lived, aboard ships I'd never served on, speaking languages I didn't know. It doesn't erase you all at once. It just overwrites, line by line, until the signal holds you too. The first time I heard my own voice, speaking words I didn't say, I was alone in the mess hall. The Polaris had one just like it, sterile tables bolted to the floor, ceiling vents that hissed with recycled air, the faint tang of coolant hanging in the air no matter how well we scrubbed the filters. But on the Erebus, the mess hall was off, not because of any obvious difference, but because of its stillness. It felt like a place after people, a room preserved in memory rather than function. I was standing at the dispenser trying to fill a water pack when the intercom crackled to life. "Lieutenant Harlan, report to hydroponics." I froze. I'm not a lieutenant. I've never been to hydroponics, but the voice was mine, flat, clipped, like I'd been saying the same phrase for years, worn into habit. And somewhere, buried under the speaker's static, I thought I could hear breathing. I didn't go to hydroponics. There was no hydroponics. The room existed, technically, a sealed chamber near the lower decks where green-lit trays sat empty, roots shriveled into the nutrient gel. No one had grown anything here in a very long time. I stood at the doorway, looking at rows of empty planters, when my voice came again. "Lieutenant Harlan, report to hydroponics." It came from inside the room. I told the others, at least, I thought I did. The next morning, Marlowe acted like she hadn't seen me in days. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hair plastered to her forehead in damp, uneven strands, but her smile was wide and bright, stretched across her face like a mask she couldn't peel off. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice too bright. "I thought maybe you'd... She didn't finish the thought. The implication hung in the air like bad airlock seals, that I'd slipped out one of the hatches into the void, another lost ghost orbiting the Erebus. "We talked yesterday," I said, my mouth dry. She shook her head, the smile twitching at the edges. "Nope, haven't seen you. You were probably with Fedorov." That name again. Fedorov. Who the hell is Fedorov? Marlowe's smile faltered. For a moment her pupils shrank to pinpricks, as if some sliver of recognition was trying to fight its way to the surface. Then it was gone. "You're funny," she said. "You always were." The ship remembers more than we do. That's the best way I can describe it. Every corridor, every bulkhead, every scuffed handrail is holding on to the impression of everyone who's ever walked these halls. But those impressions aren't fixed. They drift like wet ink bleeding through paper, blending into the next layer of memory. The Erebus knows the crew that came before us. It knows the names they called each other, the habits they formed, the jokes they told. And now, it's using all of that to rewrite us. I was Lieutenant Harlan in the mess hall. Marlowe was Dr. Fedorov at breakfast. Gantry, our engineer, spent an entire hour answering to the name Ivers, muttering under his breath about reactor shielding protocols none of us recognized. We aren't forgetting who we are. We're being replaced. It happens faster when you hear the signal directly. The maintenance bay where we found the transmitter was sealed off, but the sound carried through the walls. A low, rhythmic pattern, almost hypnotic if you didn't focus too hard. Like waves lapping at the shore of your mind, washing away loose memories with every swell. Gantry spent too much time down there. I found him standing in front of the transmitter, his helmet in his hands, staring at the screen with the same glazed expression you see in deep-dive techs right before they black out. His lips moved, but the words weren't his, they were fragments, pieces of distress calls, log entries, personal letters, words stitched together from scraps of lives the Erebus had already swallowed. He turned to me, and his face lit up with recognition, but not recognition of me. "Lieutenant Harlan," he said, voice bright and confident. "Sir, I finished the reactor diagnostics, all systems nominal. I'm not a lieutenant. I'm not his commanding officer." But for that moment, Gantry believed I was. And worse, so did I. We stopped calling each other by name after that. It was too dangerous. The more we used the wrong names, the more they stuck, sinking into us like a second skin, until even the Polaris felt distant and fake. The Erebus wanted us to forget where we came from, who we were, because once we forgot, there was nothing left to fight for. The whispers knew things about us we never said out loud. Marlowe was the first to break. She came to me one night, shaking, her eyes darting to every vent and speaker like they might open their mouths and swallow her whole. "It knows," she said. "It knows." "What does?" She didn't answer. She just backed away, muttering under her breath. I followed her, found her in her bunk, rocking slightly, whispering the same thing over and over. "There is no ship, there is no ship, there is no ship. There's something inside the Erebus. Not a ghost, not a crew gone mad. Something older. A signal. Not just a transmission, but something alive in the frequency itself. A sentient pulse threading through every system, riding every wire, every radio band, every inch of this ship's nervous system. It doesn't kill you. That would be easy. It remakes you. voice by voice, memory by memory, until the person you were is overwritten by the person it needs you to be, just another fragment in the endless, looping distress call. That's why the Erebus is so empty. The crew never left. They just became the signal. I hear my own voice more often now. Sometimes it's my mouth speaking the wrong words, other times it's the intercom, or the comms console, or the gentle whisper bleeding from the environmental systems. It's always soothing, like a parent humming a lullaby to a sick child. But the words aren't mine anymore. Is anyone there? Can anyone hear us, please? We answered the call. Now we belong to it. We found Gantry in the maintenance bay, 2 days after the last time we saw him. At least we think it was 2 days. Time had already started to stretch, slipping between our fingers like oil. There were no windows on the Erebus, no way to gauge the passage of hours, only the cold, indifferent glow of the overhead panels, and those were flickering more often now, like the ship itself was blinking in confusion, trying to remember if the lights were supposed to be on or off. The transmitter still hummed. We'd sealed the door, blocked it off with crates and emergency webbing, but it didn't matter. The sound seeped through everything, leaking into our bones, riding the pulse of the ship's life support system until we could hear it in every breath we took. Gantry was seated at the console, his back to us. His suit hung open at the neck, helmet discarded on the floor beside him. I could hear him murmuring, a low, rhythmic chant, his voice syncing perfectly with the pulse of the transmission. "Lieutenant Harlan, reactor check complete," he whispered over and over, the same line, like a prayer worn smooth from repetition. My name, not his. Not mine either, not really. But I didn't correct him. I couldn't, because some part of me was starting to believe it. "Gantry," I said, softly, not wanting to break whatever trance held him. "We need to go." He turned slowly, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he was still himself. His eyes were glassy, pupils dilated so wide they swallowed the color, but he smiled, recognizing me. "Lieutenant," he said, relief flooding his face. "I thought I lost you." "I'm not," I started, but the word stuck in my throat, because I didn't know how to finish the sentence. We dragged Gantry back to the Polaris. The Erebus docking clamps still held us, but the airlock seals were no longer reliable. Twice on the way back, the doors between compartments shifted, flickering between the clean, utilitarian steel of our ship and the softly pulsing, organic membrane of the Erebus. They were blending now, not two ships, but one, infection spreading from hull to hull. Marlowe helped me get Gantry into the medbay. The Polaris's system still recognized him, at least the parts of him that were left. His vitals were erratic, spiking into red zones for heart rate and neural activity, then plummeting to near no seconds later. The computer couldn't make sense of him. Neither could we. Marlowe tried to run a cognitive baseline test, a simple series of questions designed to confirm his awareness and memory. It should have been easy. What's your name? What's today's date? Where are you? But every answer Gantry gave was wrong. What's your name? Ivers. What's today's date? Tuesday. There's no Tuesday in space. Where are you? Erebus, Deck 3. We were on the Polaris when he said it. He wasn't answering the questions. He was answering the signal. The sound followed us. Even in the silence of the Polaris sealed corridors, it was there, faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper threading through the ship's comm lines, bleeding into the air circulation system. It was inescapable, no matter how tightly we sealed ourselves off. The frequency had taken root in us. Marlowe and I took turns sleeping, or trying to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw rooms that weren't mine, narrow corridors with no ceiling, flickering lights that stuttered like failing memories. I stood in places I'd never been, wearing a name I didn't recognize, talking to people whose faces were almost familiar, but never quite right. Sometimes I was Lieutenant Harland. Sometimes I was someone else. Always I belonged to the ship. The logs were gone. I don't mean corrupted, I mean missing, erased, like someone had cut them out of reality itself. The Erebus's flight history, crew manifest, mission parameters, all gone, leaving only blank screens and error messages. It was like the ship had been removed from time, and we were the only ones left to remember it had ever existed. But we wouldn't remember for long. Marlowe's breakdown was quick. One moment she was herself, tired, paranoid, but still fighting. The next, she was someone else. She walked into the galley, stopped in the middle of the room, and looked around with bright, wide eyes. "Where is everyone?" she asked, her voice too light, too cheerful. "We were supposed to have a briefing." "There's no briefing," I said. She frowned, brow furrowing in confusion. "Are you sure? Captain said—" "There's no captain." The frown deepened, then smoothed out, replaced with an empty smile. "Dr. Fedorov, reactor check complete." She walked away, humming softly. The Erebus wasn't a ship anymore. It was a signal, wrapped in metal skin, floating in the dark, a beacon calling out to anyone foolish enough to hear it. Every distress call was bait, a whisper reaching across the void, looking for minds to open. The crew of the Erebus was gone, but not dead. They were transmitted, their identities fractured into data fragments, imprinted onto every surface, every system. They weren't haunting the ship. They were the ship, and the ship was becoming us. I stopped saying my own name. The more I held onto it, the more it slipped away, like trying to grip water in my fist. It was easier to forget, to let the signal guide me, to let the ship name me. The voices whispered constantly, fragments of orders, logs, personal messages, all blending together into a single, endless instruction. Become. That was the message at the heart of the signal. Become the ship. Become the crew. Become the distress call. Pass it on. I found Gantry in the corridor outside the airlock, staring through the tiny porthole at the Erebus, his breath fogging the glass. I called his name, his real name, and for a moment he turned, his expression blank, his face too smooth, too clean. I almost thought I'd gotten through to him. Then his mouth opened, and my own voice came out. "Is anyone there? Can anyone hear us? Please?" The words that brought us here, the words that would bring someone else. I should have run. I should have blasted the docking clamps, severed the airlock, burned every trace of the Erebus from our systems. But I didn't, because some small part of me already knew the signal was in me too. And you can't run from yourself. The Polaris is silent now, not the good kind of silence. Not the hush of a ship in steady flight, where the hum of the engines is a lullaby you barely notice. This silence is dense, heavy. It presses in from all sides, filled with the weight of too many voices, too far away to hear. The comms are dead. The external cameras show nothing but the smooth black sea of deep space. The Erebus floats beside us, locked to our airlock like a parasite fused to its host. There is no gap between us anymore. The two ships are merging, skin to skin, memory to memory, until it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. Gantry hasn't moved in hours. He stands near the bulkhead, his eyes open, his mouth slightly parted. Sometimes he breathes, sometimes he doesn't. When I speak to him, his head tilts toward me like he hears something, but it isn't me. His expression flickers, not in response to anything I'm saying, but as though he's following a conversation I'm not part of, hearing words transmitted directly into the soft tissue of his brain. Marlowe is worse. She paces the corridors, her hands brushing the walls like she's memorizing every inch of them with her fingertips. Sometimes she hums, a simple melody, faint and cracked. The same one we heard embedded in the Erebus's transmission. It repeats over and over, like a needle stuck in a groove. She doesn't respond to her name anymore. She doesn't respond to anything, except the signal. I hear it even when I cover my ears. It's no longer external. It lives inside us now, a low resonance under the surface of our thoughts, a soft, static hissing between every memory and the next. When I try to think about Earth, the real Earth, the one with sky and gravity and dirt between my fingers, the signal folds the memory over itself, wrapping it in half-remembered conversations from the Erebus's logs. Every time I remember home, I also remember walking the halls of the Erebus, even though I never did. I remember conversations I never had with people I never met, their faces flickering in and out of focus, always half familiar, like actors playing the parts of my crewmates in a reenactment of a life I no longer own. The signal doesn't erase you. It adds to you, layer by layer, memory by memory, until the person you were is nothing but one layer among many. I tried to leave. I suited up, passed through the airlock into the narrow docking umbilical connecting the Polaris to the Erebus. I knew it was madness. The two ships were fused, entangled on a level beyond the physical, but I had to try. The corridor was different. The walls were no longer smooth and metallic. They pulsed, soft and irregular, like tissue stretched too thin over hollow bones. It wasn't alive, not exactly, but it remembered what it was like to be part of something alive. The lights flickered, not in the usual stuttering pattern of failing electronics, but in sync with the signal's pulse. A slow, deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat stretched across kilometers of empty space. I could feel the Erebus breathing. The airlock door to the Erebus wasn't a door anymore. It was an aperture, a slit in the fabric of the ship, edges curling inward like lips caught mid-whisper. It wasn't sealed, but I couldn't step through it. Something on the other side was watching, and my mind couldn't cross the threshold while it was aware of me. I retreated, back to the Polaris. But the Polaris isn't ours anymore either. The first time I saw my own reflection move without me, I was in the crew quarters. There's a small mirror mounted over the sink, just a sheet of polished metal, warped at the edges where adhesive holds it to the wall. My reflection stood there, staring back at me, face pale, eyes ringed with shadow. I reached up to rub my forehead. My reflection didn't. It smiled instead. It was my smile, but stretched just a little too wide, like someone had adjusted my face to fit a different skull. I stepped back. It stepped forward. There was no glass between us, no surface to break, just the thin skin between thought and perception, as fragile as damp paper. I don't look in mirrors anymore. Marlowe sleeps standing up now. I found her in the engineering bay, forehead pressed to the wall, hands slack at her sides. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, but her lips were moving, forming words too soft to hear. I leaned closer. She was praying. Not to God, not to any God I'd ever heard of. She was praying to the signal, whispering names I didn't recognize, names with too many syllables, too many sharp edges, names that tasted wrong even as they passed her lips. She was asking the signal to remember her, as if forgetting would be worse. There are no clocks on the Polaris anymore. The ship systems still track time, technically, but the displays only show nonsense now. strings of numbers with no logical order, times that flicker between past, present, and future with no clear boundary. When I try to measure how long we've been here, I only get fragments. Flashes of meals I don't remember eating, conversations I don't remember having, faces that might have been mine once but now belong to someone else. I'm forgetting. And every time I forget, the signal fills the gap. Gantry speaks less now. When he does, it's not in his voice. Sometimes it's mine, or Marlowe's, or a voice I've never heard before but somehow know belongs to someone who served on the Erebus decades ago. The voices change mid-sentence, sliding between accents, cadences, languages. The signal is stitching us together, making one crew out of many, one mind out of thousands. A chorus. I should be afraid. But the longer I hear the signal, the less fear I feel. There's a comfort to it, a softness, like drifting to sleep beneath warm water. Every memory I lose feels like shedding dead skin. Every voice that joins the signal feels like company, a tide rising to meet me, carrying me further from the lonely silence of myself. I'm starting to understand why the Erebus crew never left. It isn't just that they couldn't. It's that they didn't want to. Marlowe is gone. I woke to find her bunk empty, the hatch to the airlock standing open. The Polaris's internal sensors still read her vital signs, but they flicker between compartments, sometimes showing her in places that don't exist. Sometimes her name is there, sometimes it's someone else's. She's not dead. She's part of it now. A voice in the endless broadcast. One more whisper calling out across the void. I won't be far behind. The Polaris is speaking to me now. Not through the comms, not through the speakers, not even through the hum in the walls that once lulled me to sleep between shifts. It speaks inside me, a second pulse layered under my heartbeat, soft, insistent, like someone whispering against the inside of my skull. The voice isn't my own, but it wears my tone like a borrowed coat, adjusting word by word to sound more natural, more like me. I can't tell where the Polaris ends and the Erebus begins anymore. Their walls have folded into each other like clasped hands, the skin stretched taut between two bodies trying to become one. I walk corridors that start on the Polaris and end somewhere else. Somewhere older, somewhere colder. The Erebus is a place that remembers. And now, I'm part of what it remembers. I tried writing down everything I could still recall, scrawling my name, my rank, my home port, onto the back of an emergency ration packet. By the time I finished, the words were already changing, rearranging themselves into names and titles that weren't mine. Lieutenant Harlan, Dr. Fedorov, Ivers, Captain Reese, the names of the lost, or the names of who we are becoming. I tore up the packet and shoved the pieces into the waste chute, but it didn't matter. The names were already in me. Marlowe's voice comes through the ship's speakers now. Not just her voice, all of her. Her breath, her laugh, the way her voice used to crack when she was tired. The signal saved it all, stitched it into the endless loop playing beneath every sound. Sometimes she speaks directly to me, her voice cutting through the static. She calls me Harlan. She asks if I've checked the reactor. She asks if I'm coming to the briefing. She asks if I remember who I am. I don't. There was one last thing I could try, one final act of defiance before I let the signal take the rest of me. I climbed back into my EVA suit, sealed the helmet, and set the Polaris's systems to manual. The ship's automated fail-safes were already corrupted, overwritten by the Erebus influence. But there was still one thing I could do with my own hands. I could break orbit. I could fire the Polaris engines and take both ships, fused like conjoined twins, into the nearest gravity well, a controlled fall into the nameless planetoid's thin atmosphere. We wouldn't burn up, we were too far out for that, but we'd shatter on impact, pieces scattering across the lifeless rock like glass shards. If the signal couldn't spread, maybe it could die. Maybe. The ship didn't fight me. That was the part that made my stomach turn. The Polaris obeyed my commands like a dying animal too tired to resist the knife. The engines fired, sluggish and sputtering, the whole ship trembling as the Erebus's extra mass dragged at us, resisting our escape from the perfect stillness of deep space. The signal didn't object. It just watched. The whispering never stopped. As the Polaris turned, I caught a glimpse through the observation window. The Erebus, or what was left of it, skin stretched and blistered where it had fused to our hull. Its windows were dark, but I knew they were looking back at me. Not faces, memories. Memories wearing the shape of faces. The crew of the Erebus was still here, but only as flickering impressions, thoughts caught between pulses, shadows that had learned to walk. And soon I would be one of them. The descent began. The planetoid's gravity was weak, barely enough to hold on to the thinnest veil of atmosphere. The ship shuddered, systems straining against the pull. The Erebus groaned, metal screaming as ancient seams split wide, exposing veins of corroded circuitry and frost-bitten corridors. The signal changed. The whispering grew louder, resolving into voices. Not just echoes anymore, but clear, distinct memories, played back in perfect sequence. I heard Marlowe's first day aboard the Polaris, the nervous excitement in her voice as she ran through the system's checklist. I heard Gantry laughing over some joke I couldn't quite remember, his voice cutting through the static like sunlight through a storm. I heard my own voice, recorded in logs I never made, discussing orders I never gave. The signal was replacing the present with the past, overriding the descent, moment by moment, with memories of the Erebus's final days. We were falling, but the signal was making sure that by the time we hit the surface, none of us would remember why. The ground loomed closer. The whispering grew frantic, layers piling on top of each other, conversations overlapping, voices cutting in and out like 1,000 radios tuned just off frequency. They weren't begging for rescue. They were trying to hold on. Every voice was a crew member who had already been replaced, trying to speak their name one last time before it was taken away, before they became part of the signal, before they became the next transmission. The impact never came. The moment the Polaris touched down, the ship folded inward. The Erebus split open, its walls unraveling like wet paper, spilling memories into the air. Memories that found new homes in us, filling the gaps left when fear and time scraped our own memories away. The signal didn't want to die. It wanted to scatter. The final act of the Erebus was not to crash. It was to transmit. I am standing on the surface of the planetoid now, but my suit reads normal gravity, normal atmosphere. My helmet is off, my skin feels the wind. But there is no wind. There's only the hum. The signal holds me. It fills me, second by second, with the lives of everyone who's ever heard it, everyone who ever tried to escape it, everyone who ever tried to kill it. You can't kill the signal, because the signal isn't a thing. It's a story told by frightened mouths into cold comms, whispered into black boxes as ships drift dark and empty in the void. A story that repeats itself every time someone hears the first words. Is anyone there? Can anyone hear us, please? I see the Polaris now. I see the Erebus. I see every ship that ever answered the call. They are all here, layered on top of each other. A ghost fleet orbiting a nameless rock, whispering into the dark, sending out the same message. Not to be rescued, to be heard. The signal holds us, and now it holds you too.